All right, everybody, this one is going to be standard deal flow. This is kind of the external process piece, not as much the internal Brandt Cap specific methodology. This, out of all of the sort of things, aside from probably the internal deal flow structure, is the part of this whole process, the business divestiture, sale, acquisition, whatever side of the transaction you're on, process that changes the least from deal to deal. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. We'll kind of start out with an outline of what we'll talk about. So buyer lead is going to make contact. They then are going to fill out a non-disclosure agreement and a personal financial statement. NDA is always mandatory. The personal financial you can use your discretion on, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes here. The buyer will then receive a memorandum or prospectus from someone at our firm, usually you, the broker, occasionally operations staff, depending on the size of the deal and what you're having us handle for you. The buyer then is going to issue either an LOI or a purchase agreement. We'll touch on that here in a second. They then will dive into the due diligence phase where they're kind of double checking all of the stuff that we showed to them. We, again, as a firm, make no guarantees about the financial state of a company or any of the accuracy, I should say, of any of the financials or information that we provide to the potential buyer. That's all on the actual seller themselves. We're kind of at the mercy of what they give to us. The buyer then issues a purchase agreement if they haven't already. Generally, they would not have, but sometimes on small deals you'll see that. Then the buyer and seller obviously close, and the transition will start. So initially, this is kind of the basics. The first sort of piece of this process is the buyer lead is going to make contact. This happens in one of two ways typically. One, they are coming through Biz Buy Sell or wherever we have this business listed. The second option is we've reached out. So you, the broker, has proactively reached out to a potential acquirer. That's usually because we have them in one of our databases, whether it's our sort of active buyer list or database that we maintain. People have expressed interest on similar businesses or have added themselves over the years. Or it's more of a strategic buyer, a private equity group, or a competitor or someone like that we've reached out and asked to sign a non-disclosure and see if they had an interest. Once that lead has made contact, or in the latter scenario I just described, we've made contact with them, we do ask that they've become vetted. So we do that, either, again, you, the broker, or someone internally on our ops staff. There's two things that we ask for. The non-disclosure agreement is imperative, very self-explanatory. I think we all know why that's being implemented. The personal financial statements we use generally when it's smaller deals. We're not positive that the person who's expressed interest is qualified to acquire the business. And it's really just a time-saving device for you, the brokers, for us internally on the ops side, to make sure that we're not dealing with tire kickers, which there are plenty of them out there. So again, you have a pretty good idea as the brokers, kind of the front line, interacting with both the buyers and sellers on these transactions, whether or not you feel a PFS is necessary for any given potential acquirer. So we do recommend you get it. However, it's not mandatory in the same sense as the NDA. Once that's happened, they filled out at least the NDA, preferably both the NDA and the PFS. We share with them, again, either the broker or the ops team, the memorandum or prospectus that has been drafted, and they can then make a decision on whether or not they're interested in moving forward, issuing an LOI, etc. Generally, and let's say they've decided, okay, we like the prospectus, we like at face value what we've seen, the potential buyer will issue a letter of intent. The LOI is going to outline a couple of different things, and this is where the first sort of piece of negotiation starts to happen. So this is where a lot of savvy buyers are going to probably say, look, we want to start discussing price and terms and whatever, so there's no surprises, assuming that due diligence goes as planned. A lot of people, usually buyers with less experience, slightly less sophisticated, may just say, okay, we're going to issue an LOI at asking price and kind of, say we're going to pay cash or whatever. And then we'll leave the negotiations to the back end, the purchase agreement piece of this. There's a risk in doing that. In my experience and in our opinion, if they do defer kind of the negotiations all the way to purchase agreement time, there is the opportunity to, one, waste everyone's time during due diligence if they're under the assumption they can get it for less long term, or something of that nature. Alternatively, you risk, on sort of the softer side of things, hurting the relationship between seller and buyer if the negotiations become too contentious on the back end and the buyer is asking that the seller to stay on. That can kind of get a little tricky through the transition and kind of on into the future. So we recommend that you kind of advise the seller to negotiate on the front end. So make sure that when you have a potential buyer issuing an LOI, do your best to kind of say, look, we want to get some of the negotiation out of the way just so we have no surprises long term. Again, not mandatory, just something that strategically will help the process, and long-term for our clients, who 95% of the time are the sellers, it's going to make their lives a lot easier heading through into the transition once the business actually gets sold. So within that LOI, a couple of things obviously that you want to look for. There's certainly much more included, and obviously the seller will need to consult with their counsel. Any quick and dirty questions we'll do our best to answer. Negotiation is going to be centered around obviously a couple different things. So number one is going to be the price. And then number two is going to be kind of the terms. And it says financing terms here, but there's certainly more to it than that. Price, obviously very straightforward. Financing terms, again, fairly straightforward. Kind of jumping down to contingencies. The only thing to keep an eye on here is, if they're saying, hey, look, we want the seller to carry back, 50% of this deal or 20% of the deal or whatever, that's one thing. Do keep an eye on a clause that says there's a financing contingency, which means that it's contingent on the purchaser obtaining financing from somewhere else, usually a bank. That can be really tricky, especially if we don't really have a good picture of what that potential acquirer's personal financial situation is. So as a result of that, anytime there's a contingency in there, and really even if there's not, we recommend that during this LOI phase, the potential buyer puts in some chunk of money. It doesn't need to be a lot, but something that will sting a little bit, $5,000, $10,000 into an escrow account that basically says you can't just walk away just because you decide you don't want this business. It's more than anything else a way to kind of determine that they're serious. If they find something materially wrong with the business or something that's grossly different than what was described to them in the prospectus, then they obviously get their money back and they can go on their merry way. But it's a bit of a protection for both you as a broker, us as a firm, and then obviously for our clients to make sure that our time isn't being wasted. Again, just a couple of final items. The due diligence terms, the proposed closing date, it's really just a timeline thing. For most of these small transactions, you don't need more than a couple of weeks to do due diligence. So if you have someone that's asking for 60 days, 90 days, or whatever, depending on the size of the deal, that may be unrealistic. So just something to kind of keep in mind. Once the LOI has been accepted by both parties or issued by the buyer and okayed by the seller, the buyer generally is going to go into their due diligence phase. We've listed here sort of some things that you can sort of reasonably expect to be requested by a potential buyer. These things are absolutely subject to change based on the industry, based on the specific business. There are a million other things that can be asked for, and pretty much nothing is off limits. Typically, you're going to see tax returns being requested, or I should say 99% of the time, you're going to see tax returns requested. Typically, on small deals, and pick a number here, but $2 million or less, probably going to ask for the last 3 years. Occasionally, if it's a more sophisticated buyer or it's a bigger deal, they may ask for 5. On what we call the soft financial stuff, so nothing that's really sort of guaranteed or validated. Again, 3 to 5 years on profit and loss statements, cash flow statements, balance sheets. The profit and loss, the P&L, is going to be obviously the most important. It's a really quick and dirty way for a potential buyer to say, hey, I like this, I don't like it, blah, blah, blah. We generally ask, if possible, for the seller to have those put together or recast into monthly breakouts, just because it's good to understand the seasonality, if there is any, within a business from a potential buyer's perspective. Additionally, inventory lists with values, staff lists, and then descriptions of what they're doing is very, very helpful, especially if it's a medium-sized business where, let's say, not in the terms of revenue, but let's say there's 10 or more people working there. They're going to want to know what everyone does. Customer lists as well. This is a little bit tricky, even with a confidentiality agreement. We usually say, include a customer number or whatever, but you can scrub customer names unless it's a major client. Sometimes the buyer will ask for that. It's usually just to calculate customer churn, what retention rates are, what growth rates are, stuff like that. Bank statements, very straightforward. Generally, the last 12 months is requested. Sometimes you'll just see people asking for the last 6. It just, again, depends on the buyer and the deal. And then lastly, a liability list. This is a big one for the potential buyers. They want to know, what are they on the hook for? And this is as simple as, hey, you have a phone contract, an internet contract with Cox or Verizon in the office. We need to know, what the terms are. If there's a franchise agreement, they need a copy of that. If there's a lease, they want a copy of that, et cetera, et cetera. Most sophisticated buyers, and we kind of advise that any buyer we represent does a UCC lien search, which is done via their attorneys. That'll turn up any major liabilities, loans, credit lines, credit cards, if there's anything that's in default, stuff like that. So just be aware that a lot of that stuff will be searched for. If our seller doesn't really want to relinquish it, it can be found probably anyway. So just trying to make it easier for both parties and just kind of be forthright with everything that's a liability. The final phase, this is pretty straightforward. There's going to be some final negotiations here. This is where the seller is really going to want to speak with their counsel, so they should have an attorney. Anything where it's big windfalls of cash, and generally with any divestiture or business sale, they're going to want to also speak with their accountant. There can be some pretty serious tax implications depending on the windfall or the deal structure. So this is where they're going to want to kind of have those conversations if they haven't already. Purchase documents will be issued. A couple things are going to happen. Always a purchase agreement will be issued, and a bill of sale. There are a couple of other exhibits or sort of associated documents that may be issued depending on the deal structure. This would be something like a promissory note or another type of a debt instrument that would basically say, okay, buyer agrees to pay seller X, every single month or over the next couple of years or whatever. Closing date will be set. Any final purchase price and terms will have been hashed out in those negotiations. And then ultimately, when it comes to closing, the money obviously actually changes hands. At some point, it would have been with a closing agent or an attorney to kind of act as that intermediary. The bill of sale, stock certificates are transferred, anything of that nature kind of happens. It's usually, again, handled by the attorneys. And then at that point, the transition begins, and our role is sort of finished. So it's pretty straightforward. Again, we cannot stress this enough, despite, counsel and, accountants that work for us, as a firm. The clients still need to go out and retain their own counsel, financial and legal. They can obviously forego that, but we do not have the ability to offer that advice to them. So just something to be aware of and something to advise the clients of. If you guys have any questions, obviously throughout this process, feel free to ping me or to ping Sylvia, and we will be happy to get you squared away as best we can.